Hi there everyone, my name's Renee Claassen. I am the Unit Coordinator of CIU 101 Counselling Theories, and I will be supporting your lecture during this time while we are going online. And I will be recording a lecture every week, or 2 lectures actually, because we're doing block mode. While you're watching the lecture, I really encourage you to make notes and also set aside some questions to ask your lecturer during tutorial time. I suppose the great thing about lectures is they are recorded and you can watch them several times to make sure you get everything, but you can't ask questions. So please note things down, take them to your tutorial with you online, and make sure you have clarity around the different concepts. Okay, so this week is week 2, and we will be looking at ethics and ethical principles. So let me just... Alright, so week 2, lecture 1, which is ethical issues in counselling practice. So during this lecture, we're going to talk about the importance of ethical processes within professional practice. So we're going to think about ethics in terms of what it's like to be a counsellor and what ethical practices kind of dictate what we do and don't do as counsellors. We're going to identify how working with clients can result in various situations where we need to exercise our ethical values, including our duty of care. I'm sure you've heard of duty of care before. You would have studied that in some of your other subjects, and we know that we have a duty of care to our client to ensure that they are always receiving the best care. And so through through theory and practice, we will stimulate ethical dilemmas to assist in our understanding of how to professionally work through them. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at different dilemmas, and we're going to think about the ethical stance, the legal stance, and maybe try to come up with some ideas and solutions for how to proceed. So I think that first let's cover what are ethics. Ethical beliefs, on the first dot point there, determine not just the decisions we make in the workplace, but also how we live. It is the continual study of our moral beliefs and our own moral conduct. Now, there are many ethical theories, and because ethics is a philosophy, it's a philosophical kind of thought process. How do we make decisions ethically? What are ethics, and so forth? We're not going to look into the philosophy of ethics. What we're going to look into are what are the ethical standards required for counselling as such. Our second dot point there, our ethics formulate our individual beliefs and value system, how we behave in relationships with others, and what kind of life we create through the choices that we make. So thinking there about our values and our beliefs, they are all constructed through our experiences, our culture, our environment. Our beliefs are the same, and so that is what makes up our ethical standpoint, as humans, as people, which is of course different again from the ethical standards that are required of us as community services workers and counsellors. And so finally, being ethical is a part of what defines us as individuals. Even though we all have the capacity to make ethically sound choices every day, we can find ourselves acting out unethically, exploring boundaries and making mistakes. And so, this is a normal part of developing your ethical stance and learning to become a community services worker and learning to become an ethical practitioner as a counsellor. And I think about exploring boundaries, and I think about kind of making ethical mistakes, and it reminds me of a story about a young counsellor He was a male and he was working in a school. And this counsellor, was seeing the students, and a young 17-year-old girl came to see him. And he was also young. He had just graduated and was working in the school. And, they had a very good conversation, a very good meeting. She was a vulnerable client, and he felt, that they had good rapport and were establishing a good therapeutic relationship. But it was raining outside, and, she had no coat or umbrella. So he offers her his coat, and he passes it to her, but also kind of goes to put it on her. She accepts it. Now, seemingly an innocent act. He is an ethical, moral person. Why would he let someone, go out in the rain if he has a coat or something that they can borrow? But what that led to was this client, sort of creating and constructing in her mind that was, a forward act, and that the young man or, counsellor was actually trying to, create a relationship beyond the boundary of a therapeutic relationship. Obviously he was not, but that act, that very simple, innocent act, created some confusion. And so these mistakes or these kind of errors of judgment are easy to make, and we talk a lot about those in this particular course, in this particular lecture, and I urge you to discuss those with your lecturer. The second point, as human beings, we need to strive to make conscientious ethical choices most of the time. And again, that conscientious ethical choice, thinking about the boundary, thinking about the ethical code that we work by. And of course, as counsellors, it's the Australian Counselling Association. And finally, as health professionals, however, making ethical choices is a core responsibility of our role and duty of care. So this is what we do. These are our duty of care is of utmost importance, and our ethical choices become extremely important in the course of our work. So let's have a look at this video. It's only a short one.
We live in strange times. The housing bubble burst.
Let's get rid of that.
I think ethics are of utmost importance in clinical psychology. And when I thought about why that was, we're taught this from the very beginning when we get into graduate school. The first class you have is ethics. And there's a reason for this, and I think it's that when people come to see you as a therapist, they're giving you a lot of trust, and they're telling you things that they've never told anybody else, potentially. You might, as the therapist or psychologist, know more about them than even their spouse or even maybe their mothers. So it's important, with that trust comes responsibility to take care of them and not let that dependency that they might develop upon you to influence things in a direction where they shouldn't go. So you have to be mindful as a therapist of taking care of them, having very good boundaries, and that's all in our ethics code. Our ethics code is mainly to protect clients and to make sure that they're going in a direction that's helpful for them and it's not influenced by something else going on inside of the therapist. So typically, ethics are to protect the client, also to protect the public, and to protect the psychologist, because it makes boundaries very clear. When you have that kind of a close relationship with someone, boundaries can get blurred easily if you're not very clear about your ethics and where you stand on that.
Thank you for watching The Wise Way. Subscribe to stay updated, share to pass the knowledge, or view our other videos on the left.
Okay, so I think one of the important points that came through there is why ethics and ethical standards were created and why they exist, and it really is for protection. It's both the protection of the client and protection of the worker. So what is ethical practice? We look to these 6 principles of ethical practice, originally created by Kitchener. And number 1 is being trustworthy. So we have there honouring the trust placed in the practitioner, and it's also referred to as fidelity. So as we know, the most important thing within the counselling setup is the counselling relationship between the counsellor and the client. And in order for any real and honest kind of disclosure by your client, there has to be that sense of trustworthiness. And of course, we balance that trustworthiness with confidentiality and the standards of confidentiality. There may be reasons to breach and so forth, but we have paramount, we have the most important element as being this sense of trust between the counsellor and the client. And secondly, there we have autonomy, which is respect for the client's right to be self-governing. So what does that mean? When a client is acting autonomously, it means that they are fully aware of the situation. They are making decisions based on full awareness of what is going on. So you have completely disclosed, the potential to breach if they, threaten to harm themselves or harm others, if they disclose a serious offence, if the documentation is required by a court, via a subpoena. You need to disclose. The client needs to be autonomous in their decision-making capacity. So that's what autonomy means. I'm going to go into these in more depth, but I will just brief you on each of them. I think listening to information about each is going to be beneficial. Speaking of which, beneficence, number 3, a commitment to promoting the client's well-being. So we do things that always promote the client's well-being, whether that is ensure that, I am always trained correctly, I am always up to date, I allow the client, any and all ability to receive the counselling in the best possible manner. Everything I do is for the client's benefit. That's beneficence. Number 4 is non-malfeasance, and it's a commitment to avoiding harm to the client. Now, while that does sound kind of similar to beneficence, this is more around ensuring your ethical practice. So ensuring that you are always practicing within your limits, and that if you know of anyone who is practicing outside of their limits, so in other words, saying that they can diagnose when they can't, if you're saying that you're a psychoanalyst but you haven't done the training, that's practicing out of your limits, and it's not ethical. And if you, as I was saying, if you did know about someone like that, you could report them due to their practicing outside of their understanding, and because of non-malfeasance ethical practice. So then number 5, the fair and impartial treatment of all clients and the provision of adequate services. So as we know, when we enter into a relationship that is a counselling relationship, we have a duty to empathise, or we have not so much a duty, but we have a mandate to empathise, to be congruent, to have unconditional positive regard if we are person-centred. And that is your Carl Rogers from the first lecture. And this notion of judgment, enters into it as well. We don't judge our client. We have unconditional positive regard. And when we do judge, we create, a lack of fairness, and we create partial treatment. And that's something which goes against our ethical practice. We must be just and fair and impartially look at clients so that they receive the best treatment possible. And finally, number 6, self-respect, fostering the practitioner's self-knowledge and self-care. And this has to do with you following those ethical practices in regards to yourself and ensuring that you're always well, and that you are up to date, and that you are giving yourself the same level of care that you require yourself to give your client. So we're not going to be doing this class activity, but I urge you to speak with your lecturer about the 6 principles of ethical practice. Your lecturer may have something for you to do in regards to this. And now let's go through each one more in-depthly. As you can tell, these are very important. They're going to be important for your midterm test. It's important that you know everything within this lecture, but primarily or importantly these 6 principles. So, number 1 there, being trustworthy is regarded as fundamental to understanding and resolving ethical issues. Practitioners who adopt this principle act in accordance with the trust placed in them. So we talked about the trust that's placed in you and how this is the first and foremost thing that you need to establish with your client. Regard confidentiality as an obligation arising from the client's trust. We restrict and disclose any disclosure of confidential information about clients to furthering the purposes for which it was originally disclosed. So outside of the duty of care, outside of reasons for breaching, we need to be trustworthy, and that is what the first principle is about. Number 2, autonomy. As discussed, this principle emphasizes the importance of the client's commitment to participating in counseling or psychotherapy, usually on a voluntary basis. So a counseling cannot be voluntary if a client doesn't know how this counselling is going to run, doesn't understand informed consent, doesn't understand the confidentiality issues. And that's what we go on to talk about here. Practitioners who respect their clients' autonomy ensure accuracy in any advertising or information given in advance of services offered. So we're just talking about transparency there. Seek freely given and adequately informed consent. Freely given and adequately informed consent there, those words are important because what we're talking about is when you receive informed consent from your client, which is consent to the counselling and consent to breach of counselling if necessary and so forth. If you don't fully disclose, then your client is not autonomous. I hope that that's something you can understand, that autonomy refers to a person's freedom. They understand fully, they know what they're getting themselves into, and so go into it autonomously. The 4th point there, engage in explicit contracting in advance of any commitment by the client. Protect privacy and protect confidentiality. That's just furthering the point there. Normally make any disclosures of confidential information conditional on the consent of the person concerned, and inform the client in advance of foreseeable conflicts of interest, or as soon as possible after such conflicts become apparent. So the principle of autonomy opposes the manipulation of clients against their will, even for beneficial social ends. So we disclose everything to do with confidentiality. Yes, this is confidential. This is a confidential meeting. However, if you disclose that you are going to harm yourself or harm anybody else, I will need to breach. If you commit a serious crime and disclose it to me, I will need to breach confidentiality. If there is any sense of that I need to do mandatory reporting for you or because of you, I'll need to breach. There are the different conditions. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, but hang on, how can I say this is all going to be confidential if I also inform my client that I may need to breach? And so the answer is that we balance and we support. So we fully disclose to our client, this is what we're going to do. We gain their trust by ensuring that we're transparent. But if we do need to do something, have a look at that point there. It says that we inform the client as soon as it's practicable. So as soon as something becomes obvious, we let them know. Now that you've told me that, I need to inform you I am going to have to breach and let the police know, for example, but I will support you every step of the way. We're going to do this together. And that's really the way to maintain and balance that sense of trustworthiness with the full disclosure. Number 3, beneficence. The principle of beneficence means acting in the best interests of the client based on professional assessment. So it directs attention to working strictly within one's limits of competence and providing services on the basis of adequate training or experience. Ensuring that the client's best interests are achieved requires systematic monitoring of practice and outcomes by the best available means. So those first 3 points relate exclusively to we only do what we can for the best outcome of the client. We don't practice outside of our limits. 4th point there, it is considered important that research and systematic reflection inform practice. So yes, I'm a counsellor and I've done my training and I'm doing this counselling, but I'm always keeping up to date. I'm always ensuring that what I'm transmitting within the counselling relationship is research-based, it's current, and it's coming from a place of this is what everybody else is doing. You're receiving the best care. So again, remember, beneficence is the benefit, receiving the best care. The next point there's an obligation to use regular and ongoing supervision to enhance the quality of the services provided and to commit to upgrading practice by continuing professional development. So of course you can only be of benefit if you yourself are 100%. So receiving supervision means that I'm self-caring and I'm providing my client the best of myself. And finally, an obligation to act in the best interests of a client may become paramount when working with clients whose capacity for autonomy is diminished because of immaturity, lack of understanding, extreme distress, serious disturbance, or other significant personal constraints. So when we act in the best interests of a client who has a diminished capacity, we might call it, we need to ensure that everything is set up for the benefit of the client. Does that mean they need someone else with them? Does that mean that they need, whether it be an interpreter or an additional resource? So we're always making sure that the client is receiving the best possible care. Number 4, non-malfeasance. So non-malfeasance involves avoiding sexual, financial, and emotional or any other form of client exploitation. We avoid incompetence or malpractice. We don't provide services when we're unfit to do so, when due to illness or personal circumstances or intoxication. So we do no harm. We never cross boundaries that are bad for the client, that are going to cause the client harm. We always ensure that we ourselves are in the best possible position to provide care. And you can hear that some of these cross over, but I think that the way to remember this one is the do no harm, mitigate any harm, and that's in point number 2. The practitioner has an ethical responsibility to strive to mitigate any harm caused to a client, even when the harm is unavoidable or unintended. So again, that goes in with that sense of ensuring that the client is autonomous, even though you have to breach. I need to disclose to you I'm going to need to breach, and harm is now unavoidable because you're going to be in a situation where the police are going to be involved, etc. The principle of non-malfeasance says that we do everything within our power to avoid harm. So we support our client, we give our client as much support and as many resources as we can in order for them to, in order for us to be able to mitigate the harm. Number 3, holding appropriate insurance may assist in restitution. So obviously part of doing no harm means that you need to have the appropriate insurance for those kind of situations. And practitioners have a personal responsibility to challenge, where appropriate, the incompetence or malpractice of others, and to contribute to any investigation or adjudication concerning professional practice which falls below that of a reasonably competent practitioner and or risks bringing discredit upon the profession. Again, if you see someone doing something, working outside of their limits, doing sexual or financial exploitation or any form of harm, I mean, you name it. They're not, anything that brings harm, they're not allowed to do it. It is your duty as a fellow practitioner to alert the authorities. Number 5 there, justice. The principle of justice requires being just and fair to all clients and respecting their human rights and dignity. It directs attention to considering conscientiously any legal requirements and obligations and remaining alert to potential conflicts between legal and ethical obligations. So we're looking here at the justice or the undertones of human rights and dignity and what is just and right for this particular client. And we are talking here about the legalities of our decisions. So, if we choose not to see a client, is that legal? Is that fair? We need to make sure that we are always seen to be impartial. Justice in the distribution of services requires the ability to determine impartially the provision of services for clients and the allocation of services between clients. So that goes to the point that we just made there about impartiality. A commitment to fairness requires the ability to appreciate differences between people and to be committed to equality of opportunity and avoiding discrimination against people or groups contrary to their legitimate personal or social characteristics. So we're always committed to fairness. As practitioners, we, again, do not discriminate. We do not cause harm through any kind of unfairness or discrimination. Practitioners have a duty to strive to ensure a fair provision of counselling and psychotherapy services accessible and appropriate to the needs of potential clients. And if it is the case that we cannot see a client for whatever reason, we need to ensure that we make a referral, that we're ensuring a fair provision of counselling and psychotherapy. So we're making sure that the client receives a just and fair counselling process. And finally, self-respect. The principle of self-respect means that the practitioner appropriately applies all the above principles and entitlements for themselves. This includes seeking counselling or therapy and other opportunities for personal development as required. So we talked about making self-respect being the one where, we think about all those other principles and we apply them to ourselves. So it is about ensuring we're always okay. Do we need counselling? Do we need therapy? Do we need professional development? Point number 3, there is an ethical responsibility to use supervision for appropriate personal and professional support and development, and to seek training and other opportunities for continual professional development. So we see 4 things there. We've got counselling, therapy, supervision, and professional support. So that's what's involved with self-respect, and that is obviously in relation to ourselves. So guarding against financial liabilities arising from work undertaken usually requires obtaining appropriate insurance. And so the point there is to guard against financial liabilities for ourselves. And the principles of self-respect encourage active engagement in life-enhancing activities and relationships that are independent of relationships in counselling or psychotherapy. I really like that one. That says be a whole person. Part of self-respect is not only get yourself counselling, therapy, professional support, professional development and supervision, but also live your life. So I encourage you all to discuss those during your tutorial. Make sure you learn them, make sure you engage with them and understand them. So now we're on to values. What are values? Look at this first sentence. Values are those things we value or are able to find value in. I always appreciate a description that uses the original word. What we're trying to do here is talk about things that are important to us. So what are our values? They are the things that are important to us. I think the best way of expressing that is through thinking and telling you my values. I value family. I value honesty. I value the counselling profession. I value laughter. I value food and friends. You know, who doesn't value, probably most of those things. But you may also value other things that I may not. Maybe you value religion. Maybe you value vegetarianism. Maybe you value, prayer. And maybe you value friends over family. You know what I mean? I mean, there's just a variety of different values that we can all have. And I think the important thing for you to realise in counselling is that not all people share your values. Your client may value taking drugs. Your client may value their work as a prostitute. Your client may value the way that they're in a relationship with a person who is, abusive, and yet they value that person. There are values and there are reasons for people having values that we cannot judge, and we must not judge. We have to accept and understand our own values and accept and understand others' values. The Oxford Dictionary here, definition, let's have a look. The amount of money or other commodity or service, etc., considered to be equivalent to something else for which a thing can be exchanged. Desirability, usefulness, importance, the ability of a thing to serve a purpose or cause and effect. So I think I like the best there, the ability of a thing to serve a purpose. Our values serve a purpose for us. They have been created through our environment, our culture, our experiences, the people we relate to, etc. And by having that value, it serves us a purpose. So that's values. So turning now to confidentiality, and we're going to discuss confidentiality at length because confidentiality is, one of the fundamental aspects of our whole practice. It is the bedrock of our practice, actually. And kind of just to put a bit of an end point to the previous slides, knowing our own values, knowing our ethical standpoint, knowing, ethical principles puts us in a position where we have awareness. We have self-awareness and awareness of what it is that we need to do within our practice. We need to understand ourselves and our values and therefore accept others, and we need to understand the ethical principles that constrain us. And one of the elements of those ethical principles is confidentiality. So client confidentiality is the fundamental principle in which a health practice, institution or individual practitioner may not disclose information about their clients to a third party without the consent of the client or a clear legal reason such as duty of care. Now, I get a lot of students and I receive this through videos and so forth, but I also see it in class when we used to have class and tutorials. Students saying, first of all, thank you for coming in and so forth. Everything that you talk about here, everything that we discuss is confidential. I will not disclose anything. It is all confidential. You can tell me anything. Now, you can imagine my surprise when I hear that, because that is actually incorrect, isn't it? We cannot keep everything confidential. We want our client to trust us, but we cannot keep everything confidential. And the reason for that is because there may be legal reasons why we have to breach, for example, duty of care. So you need to come up with a statement that says everything is confidential except when, and then you need to roll out the instances in which you're going to breach confidentiality. Number 2, it is the protection of a person's privacy. That's what confidentiality is. A breach of confidentiality which does not fall in line with a duty of care concern is a serious offence and can result in internal and external investigations depending on the workplace or insurance policy. So the flip side to, I'm going to keep everything confidential, don't worry, and that not being true, the flip side of that is telling everyone everything. So of course you cannot do that. You can only breach if there is a legal reason. And you cannot even discuss your client's information with a person close to you. Everything has to be kept private. You need to keep all documents private. You need to keep names of things and so forth, and we'll see that a little bit later on when we have a look at a video in regards to that. Following on now with confidentiality, respectful privacy is necessary in the development and maintenance of relationships with others, for example, the nurse-patient and client-therapist relationships. And the second point, it is the essential first step for an individual to feel safe and trusted in the hands of a practitioner. And finally, unless the client's treatment has resulted in duty of care or handed over to primary guardian, it is the client's decision as to what personal information they wish to share with others. So yes, we want to establish trust. Yes, we can do confidentiality, and we will not disclose unless there is a need to breach. And when there is, it is your decision. It is your decision for me to share. That's informed consent. But and when I need to breach outside of those things, like to tell someone else or to discuss with a therapist who is also seeing you, so another practitioner, allied healthcare, for example, you need the consent of your client, and that's what we're talking about here. So there's legal breach, and there's also informed consent. Personal information is regarded as personal property. Once a client discloses this, they are expecting the practitioner to be accountable in maintaining this personal property. So that's really important. Anything they say to you, if you have written it down, and if it is something that has transpired within the counselling session, it is the property, it is personal information that you now have been given. The Health Records Act 2001 gives patients the right to access information about themselves, although medical records may be owned by doctors and healthcare facilities, so they are owned by the professional, but they're accessible. The general rule within health practices in Australia is client records are stored for 7 years before they are destroyed. And that goes for all counsellors. I'm sure your lecturers will tell you the same thing. They keep all their records locked for 7 years and then they are destroyed. And the reason for that is that, records may become needed later on by a court of law. Say, for example, your client has been involved in some sort of legal action, and it looks like they, may have been seeing a counsellor. Who knows if it's part of the defence. Perhaps they need to see the notes. What did they say? What were they saying back then? And you need to have those files ready and accessible for the court. Let's have a look at a video regarding patient confidentiality.
Hello, Dr. Mehta. This is Mrs. Sharma. My husband has been hospitalized due to severe shortness of breath.
Okay, don't worry, Mrs. Sharma. I will come and see him right away. Sunidhi, Mr. Sharma, who is in trial, is hospitalized for shortness of breath. We have to inform the health authority and the sponsors within the timelines. I will go to the hospital and check on him now, and when I'm back, we can fill in the forms.
Okay, doctor.
Sunidhi, fill in the other basic details required from his records. Make sure you black out the patient's name and date of birth in all places before you fax in the information. We have to ensure patient's identity is not revealed. We will send out the forms first thing tomorrow morning to meet our timelines. Sunidhi, please send out those forms as discussed yesterday. I have to go for an urgent visit to the hospital for another patient.
Okay, doctor. Now the discharge summary is also available. I will send that out too.
Please ensure patient identifiers are marked in everything.
Miss Sunidhi, I have received the forms for an SAE from your site this morning. Required information is present, but the discharge summary contains the name of the patient and all his personal details. That should have been masked before it was sent to us.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I had masked all the identifiers.
Miss Sunidhi, this violates the patient's rights, as his identity is supposed to be confidential and should not be revealed to the sponsor. It is a critical non-compliance. I will need to report it in my system as such. I will stay in touch with you.
I think you get the picture. So, masking is what that video called when we remove client details. And look, when we put away our files, we really should not be putting away the notes together with the identifying information. Those notes should be able to be picked up by anybody, and it should not be known that that particular note relates to a particular client. Those things should be kept separately, ideally, because in terms of confidentiality, it's really, really important, because anybody can access those notes. So we need to make sure that we're always keeping documents just as confidential as our own, selves. We don't want to be disclosing information to people, and we don't want to be showing people information that they shouldn't be seeing. So how else can we, or how do we uphold confidentiality? So individual files related to the client are locked and secured. We discussed that. We do that for 7 years. Support workers do not tell other people what is in a client's file unless they have consent to consult with the client. So we need permission from the client, and that permission is gained either initially. Well, we should be gaining that initially. We should be stating that, we work with colleagues and maybe they're going to look, so we need a signature. But ideally, you should be gaining that on a moment-by-moment basis. Information about client is not disclosed to people outside of the client's care and therefore do not need to know. We talked about that. Clients' medical details are not disclosed to others. As you saw in the video, adult clients have the right to keep any information about themselves confidential, which includes that information being kept from family and friends. And that's really important for you to realise that all of your, perhaps up until now in your life, there isn't very much that you've kept from your family and friends, and maybe your family has always known what you particularly have been talking to your doctor about, or if you ever went and saw anybody else, they would also confer with your family. As a counsellor and in the counselling profession, that is absolutely not what happens. Your client can at any time say, or it is expected that your client would say, please only contact my family or friends with my permission. It is absolutely not appropriate that any family be allowed to know what has been going on. With a minor even, I would be seeking consent, because of course the number one priority is trustworthiness. So every time you're thinking, I need to, somebody should know about this, it is always through consent. The practitioner does not have an incidental conversation with clients outside of the session or appointment. So where I live in a small sort of country town, kind of regional town outside of the main area of Melbourne, and I used to practice up here. Now what that used to mean was, I no longer do it up here, but I used to, go down to Woolies and I would see a client. And so part of confidentiality, part of maintaining the confidentiality is not saying, hey, Beth, how you going? How you going since we spoke, last time? That completely breaks confidentiality and is completely, excuse me, I have hair in my face, is completely inappropriate. And basically what I used to say at the very first session was, look, we may see each other, but I will not approach you, I will not acknowledge you. It is entirely up to you whether you do that to me. Because you can't guarantee it living in a small town. And I highly recommend not practicing in the small town where you live. The practitioner is discreet if seeing the client in public does not go over and say hello to maintain the client's confidentiality, which is what we just discussed. The types of information that is considered confidential. So that's the name, date of birth and age, the sex and address. So notice that in that video, all of that was masked out. The current contact details of family and guardian, their bank details, their medical history or records, mental health and wellbeing concerns and issues. And that's really important that you know that. That is actually confidential. So no one is required to disclose their mental health and wellbeing concerns at any time. It is entirely up to the person whether they disclose that. You cannot disclose file notes, individual personal plans, assessments or reports like psychometric testing or letters of consent. Quite often when you begin to see a client, you also are given a report or assessments from other, say, counsellors, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, etc., which will include some testing. And all of that is to be kept confidential. Guardianship orders, so that relates to minors who are either with one parent or another or have been taken away from their parents, I know with foster parents and so forth. All of that information is to be kept completely confidential. Incoming or outgoing personal correspondence, emails and letters, so anything with that client's name. I think that's become abundantly clear. Anything with that client's name, whether it's correspondence or the form they filled out, is to be kept confidential. And finally, racial origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs are to be kept confidential as well. So all of these things to do with your client, it is fundamental that you understand, remember, and are able to know exactly what types of information is considered confidential. So as a counsellor, you may come across a scenario where maintaining 100% confidentiality is challenged. Generally, it would be encouraged to communicate this limitation to upholding confidentiality to your client, but it is important to assess if the client's safety to themselves or others is at risk first. So here's where we look at judgment. We look at what is it about this situation? What is it about this situation that is leading me to think I need to breach confidentiality? You know, what's at stake here? Is it my client's safety? Is it someone else's safety? You need to really consider, you know, what's leading you to that choice. And I share this story with my students. I had a client and I'd been seeing him for months and months, and he had been in drug rehabilitation, and he had been in, you know, gangs, and he'd grown up in a very rough kind of upbringing, and sort of was now sort of looking very good, doing very well, and looking for his first job. So he was seeing me. And he came in that day, and he had been fantastic. He came in that day, he sat down, he was wearing his full leather outfit. Like, he had this leather jacket and leather pants, and he came in and he had like a studded belt. And he came in that day, he said, "Well, Renee, as soon as we finish this, I'm going to go home, I'm going to dig up my gun, and I'm going to kill my brother." So he knew the limits of confidentiality, he knew everything, and I knew him, and I said, okay, you know, thinking on some level, this is important. This is one of the reasons why we breached. Should I pick up the phone now? What should I do? But I had him with me, so we had a conversation. So he said to me, "My brother has been using my mum's pension money, and I'm sick and tired of him, and I'm going to go and I'm going to knock him off, you know. It's over for him." So I could hear mainly he was very angry with the brother, and I know that this guy doesn't normally, you know, act out in those sort of ways. So we had a very long conversation, and I made a decision after the long, you know, after the therapy, and we did some meditation, we did some calming things, you know. I realised, and I was able to assess, that it was an empty threat, that he was not actually going to do that at all. We talked about the brother, the relationship, and so on and so on. We talked about techniques, and I didn't report it. Now, that is a clear breach, and I own up to it. Nothing happened. Shane went on to get a job and be terrific. But I made that decision based on my client's ultimate safety. So I made a decision there to not contact the police, even though his first words were, "Hi Renee, how are you?" Looked at his watch. "After we finish this, I'm going to dig up my gun." And the reason for that was because by the end of the session, I had made that decision that he was of no harm to anybody, not even himself. He was just an angry person who was upset that his mum was so sad, and we discussed ways and sorted out ways that he could manage that anger and have a proper conversation with his brother. The law did require it, though. I'll leave it to you to make up your mind whether you think or what you think about that situation. Cases where the law requires disclosure of information, which will be if the health or the welfare of a child or young person is at risk, you are required to contact Department of Community Services and notify them of your concerns. if your client tells you he or she has committed a serious crime, you are required to notify your supervisor or the police directly. So these are the legal kind of benchmarks in which you will be required to disclose. So number one, the welfare of a child, there's no question. Number two, a serious crime has been committed, you are required to reveal it. If a worker is subpoenaed to present information in a court of law, so we talked about those documents that might be needed, if a case comes up later on, and when the client's safety to self is at risk of harm, intent to suicide, or self-harm. Additionally, when a community member is at serious risk due to the client or client threatened to harm another and has means to act out his plan, so that was my situation. A statistical reason per workplace policy. Now, we don't often talk about this one, but it is really important. I worked with an organisation, a charity called Griefline, and when we received information, when we received the phone call, we took down details which we needed to upload to a computer package which was provided to us by the government, because the government were financing our organisation. So in order for the government to give us money, they said, look, we also want statistics related to the type of caller that you get, and we would ask questions, type them in, and that information would be sent directly to the government. Now, that's something that we needed, or we did, disclose to the caller. Just so you know, I'm entering, data into a database. There's no names or anything like that. It was really just age, gender, I think it was work status and a couple of other things, and that's going to the government. So, that's a circumstance where we need to tell the client that information is also being shared. And the requirements of professional supervision, training, workshops or seminars. So a client must know that you have supervision, that in that supervision there are details which you disclose. Now and I generally in supervision, I tend to keep the names private, but certainly the details I share. Now, one of the legal reasons that we have for breach is duty of care. Community workers or counsellors have a responsibility to keep clients in keeping them safe. So when a client discloses the intent to self-harm or suicide, we need to make the appropriate notifications so we can ensure the client is assisted. Often clients may not be emotionally regulated to articulate this, but allude to it via evasive messages or comments about their intent or well-being. And this is where we need to use our clinical judgment to decide if duty of care needs to be acted upon. And that's what I used in my decision with my client. My clinical judgment was that he was not going to harm anybody, but that's risky as well, isn't it? How ethical is that to allow excuse me, I've been talking for a while, to allow people to use clinical judgment, and yet we can. There are several aspects to consider when acting on duty of care, and you need to think about these aspects when we talk about dilemmas, which is coming up. So what is the legal aspect? What does the law say that we need to do? What does the law enforce that we do, it says there. So legally, what are my requirements? Does it come under these things, which we know is legal, or this? Right? What is my professional and ethical requirement? What does the workplace policy or code of ethics state that we do? I was working alone in that situation, which we discussed just before about my client. So I was working as a sole practitioner. But if I was working as part of an organisation where they kind of remove all of that clinical judgment or whatever it is, and they say, look, you must report, this is the code, and, at induction they teach you that, then, that comes forward as well. That becomes something that you need to consider when you're acting Organisational, what does your organisation and its funding body say that we do? Didn't I mention that our funding body is the government when I worked at Griefline? So the organisation, you know, that funding required certain limitations or certain codes to be kept, and you know, obviously that was something I had to consider when I worked there. What about the community? So we're looking at a larger or broader context. What does the client or clients' external supports, family, friends and other community members expect us to do? Why is that important? Why is it important what family and friends expect us to do? Do you need to take that into account? And personally, what do your own beliefs and values suggest that you do? What do our own beliefs and values suggest we do, says that dot point. So there are several aspects to consider when acting on duty of care. I think this would be a really important thing to discuss with your lecturer. Think of some situations and then discuss what would they do, what should you do based on these considerations. There is a type of reporting which is called mandatory reporting, mandated reporting in Australia, as the heading says. So mandated reporting at the first dot point is a legislative requirement enforced on selected professionals to notify any reportings or suspicions of child abuse and neglect to government authorities. Excuse the spelling mistakes here. Mandatory reporting laws are enacted in each state of Australia, however vary slightly depending on the state legislation. And these differences over what is considered reportable cases of child abuse and neglect and who is responsible to report to government services. I believe by now you would have heard of mandatory reporting, and that is reporting of sexual abuse in the case of a minor. And every state is different. For example, some states you can have an inkling or an idea that that's what's going on, but not know for sure, and you are required to report to police. Or in other states, you need to have proof. So if you can prove that that's what's happening, then you report to police. So it'll depend on which state you live in as to what the requirement or the regulation is. So moving on now to consent. As practitioners, we will often request consent from our clients. This is often a legal obligation which allows the clients to provide written or informed consent for their practitioner to consult with another. So this is the type of consent that is about, do you consent to me talking to somebody else about your case? That's what that is. And so consent is generally requested for sharing client information within the clinical care network, so a GP, a mental health worker, midwife, etc., psychiatrist, another psychologist. Honestly, this goes on a lot in counselling. I had clients all the time with whom, I was talking to other people about them, and if I hadn't had that consent, then we all would have kind of been working in isolation. I remember this one instance, I had a client who had a dissociative disorder, and what that means is that from time to time she would completely dissociate from the current situation based on a trigger. She had borderline personality disorder, and she kind of couldn't remember what had been going on at that time. So she had seen her psychologist in regards to her dissociative disorder and her bipolar disorder, but she was also seeing me in relation to finding a job. I used to work for a disability employment service as their counsellor. So I got a phone call. I received a phone call from her psychologist to tell me she had just had an episode. We talked about that. We talked about kind of what had happened to her and where she'd ended up. And then I saw her, and I was able to discuss with her that conversation that we'd had. She had hoped that I'd had that conversation, and so we sort of had this big kind of session in regards to how she was feeling now and where she was kind of likely to go. I think she was going for a job at McDonald's at that time, and that was all due to, we doing the whole consent allowance. So we did the informed consent. She signed it. She knew that that's what was going on. But if I hadn't have done that consent or had that consent from her, then I would not have been able to speak. It would have been a breach of confidentiality. Sometimes consent is needed, yes, to share information, but also to proceed with referral or to make contact with family and friends to discuss a treatment plan. Although it is not an expectation that our client will want to speak to family and friends, sometimes it's actually a really great benefit that they allow that to happen, because remember, our client sees us and then goes back into their environment and goes back into their world. If you've got a family member or friends who are there supporting the client, then of course, that makes the whole transaction even more beneficial for the client, because not only are they supported by us, but they enter a world of support. But again, only with consent. So ethics in the workplace is another matter we need to consider. As individuals, we set our own ethics in which we create choices from, and in this workplace, we are blinded or bound, that should say, by a code of ethics or ethical practice which is established by our place of employment. I think I need to do 2 corrections now. As counsellors, you will all subscribe to a code of ethics and or a code of professional practice. The code of ethics in which practitioners subscribe to is an acknowledgement and confirmation of their responsibility to uphold workplace ethics, and in most cases it will be linked into your employment agreement, which subsequently outlines serious repercussions to your employment status if not upheld. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about our code of ethics. I'm talking about the Australian Counselling Association Code of Ethics, or the Psychotherapy and Counselling Federation of Australia, PACFA, Code of Ethics. I'm talking about the Code of Ethics for ACQA. I'm talking about all the rules and regulations that are set in place by which you are bound, not blinded, and that is your code of ethics, and you will know them depending on what your profession is. So as a professional community services worker, it's ACQA, and as the ACQA Code of Ethics, and as a social worker, it's the Australian Social Work Association Code of Ethics, and for Australian counsellors, it's the Australian Counselling Association Code of Ethics. So, and in addition to that, you've got your workplace code of ethics. As it says here, in addition to the code of ethics in a workplace, we may come across moral dilemmas, questions or scenarios that don't fall under the code of conduct or a straightforward ethical concern. So here are those dilemmas we've been talking about. So you've got your work code of ethics, your ACA code of ethics, and yet there is still a grey area. There is still an area in which you need to use your clinical judgment, which we've been talking about throughout this lecture. So to assist our decision making when we are faced with a moral dilemma, it's always beneficial to assess our most appropriate options. And a way to facilitate this process is by asking for assistance. So what we have here is the Ethics Centre. So here are some links to external sites. The Ethical Centre links to an external site. You can click on that. It is a not-for-profit organisation which has been assisting individuals on the complexities of ethics and ethical dilemmas for over 25 years, and the Ethics Centre operates a free ethics helpline called Ethicall. This service provides a confidential platform for people to seek support around navigating decisions and situations that hold ethical challenges, and the team at Ethicall caters to all kinds of ethical challenges at individual, organisational and industry events. We have come to the end of today's lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next up is your tutorial. In your tutorial, you'll be looking at some cases, and hopefully being able to, with your lecturer, make some, create some outcomes, make some decisions, use what you know and what you've learned within this lecture, plus your own ethical stance to come up with some options for the ethical dilemmas. I hope you've enjoyed today. I look forward to recording the next lecture, which will be about psychoanalysis. So look forward to seeing you next time or hearing from you.